Jennifer Martinez had always been the type of person who read everything. Every email from Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association landed in her inbox, and she processed each one with the kind of attention most people reserved for legal contracts. This attention to detail had served her well in her corporate accounting career, and retirement hadn't softened that instinct. If anything, it had sharpened it. With more time on her hands, Jennifer found herself scrutinizing things other people would simply accept. The Oak Ridge Heights community was beautiful, a planned development built in the 1990s with 287 homes spread across 30 acres of manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and carefully maintained common areas. Jennifer had moved there 3 years ago after her divorce, choosing a modest 2-bedroom ranch that she paid for in full. No mortgage, no complications. She wanted her golden years to be simple, and Oak Ridge seemed to promise exactly that, but simplicity was being tested by the numbers that didn't quite align. It started with a casual observation during the monthly HOA statement that arrived in May. The landscaping budget line showed an expense of $18,400 for common area maintenance. Jennifer had lived in the community long enough to know that seemed high for a single month. She mentioned it to her neighbor while walking her golden retriever, Marcus, one evening. The neighbor shrugged and said everyone on the board was probably doing their best, which was exactly the kind of apathetic acceptance that made Jennifer's skin crawl. She pulled out the previous 12 months of statements, spreading them across her dining room table like a dealer laying out cards. What she discovered was a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as a casual overage. The landscaping expenses fluctuated wildly. In January, the figure was $8,200. By March, it had jumped to $21,000. By May, that $18,400 figure, but there was no corresponding explanation. No special projects were mentioned, no seasonal justification. The minutes from the monthly board meetings, which were vaguely detailed at best, made no mention of unusual landscaping needs. Jennifer created a spreadsheet. She was good at spreadsheets, color-coded tabs, cross-referenced line items, comparative analysis. By the end of a week, she had documented $147,300 in expenses over the past 18 months that didn't have clear justification. Some categories showed wildly inconsistent amounts with no explanation in the meeting minutes. The reserve fund had supposedly been supplemented twice, but the line items showed as miscellaneous operating expenses without detail. The HOA reserve fund was supposed to be sacred. It was meant to cover major repairs to common infrastructure, the pool equipment, the gatehouse, the roads. Every homeowner paid into it, and it was managed with the understanding that it was everyone's future security. Jennifer had seen enough HOA disasters in the news to understand that when reserve funds were mismanaged, entire neighborhoods could collapse into financial chaos. She attended the next HOA board meeting in June, bringing with her a printed analysis and a leather folder. The monthly meetings were held in the community center, a modest building adjacent to the pool. The board consisted of 5 members: Charles Vining, the president, who was a retired investment banker with silver hair and a practiced handshake; Margaret Sullivan, the vice president, a woman in her 70s who seemed more interested in the donuts provided than the actual meeting; David Chen, the secretary, a middle-aged accountant who at least seemed competent; and then there was Theodore Hartley, a younger man in his 50s who handled maintenance concerns. And then there was Patricia Wooding, the treasurer. She was a thin woman with reading glasses perpetually hanging from a chain around her neck, and she managed the finances with what Jennifer assumed was supposed to be competence. Patricia had been the treasurer for 7 years, though Jennifer had only been paying attention to her work for the last few weeks. When the meeting opened, after the obligatory reading of previous minutes and approval of agenda items, Jennifer stood up. Every eye in the room turned toward her. There weren't many residents at the meeting, maybe 15 people scattered among the folding chairs. Most people didn't come to these things. Most people didn't care enough to come. Jennifer's carefully worded statement began with a question about the landscaping budget variance. She didn't accuse. She didn't assume. She simply pointed to the numbers and asked for clarification. Her tone was professional, almost apologetic in its deference. This was Jennifer's gift. She could make the most damning observation sound like a simple request for information. Charles Vining's face shifted. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a pause before he smiled, and assured her that all expenses were properly documented and accounted for. Margaret nodded along enthusiastically, as though that settled the matter. But Patricia, the treasurer, said nothing. She simply stared at her own spreadsheet, her jaw working slightly like she was calculating something in her head. Jennifer pressed forward with additional questions. What about the $31,000 in contractual services last quarter? What specific services? How many bids were obtained? Where were the contracts themselves? Could she review the documentation? The meeting grew uncomfortable. Charles assured her that all matters of finance were routine and properly managed. David Chen, the secretary, suddenly became very interested in the agenda items remaining. Theodore asked about a pothole on Magnolia Drive, as though that might distract everyone from the conversation, but Patricia just kept staring at her spreadsheet, and her hands had begun to tremble. After the meeting adjourned, Jennifer was approached by Patricia in the hallway. The treasurer's face was pale, her voice low and urgent. She said that Jennifer should submit a formal request for a financial audit. It was her right as a homeowner. Patricia said it quickly, her words tumbling over each other, and then she walked away before Jennifer could ask any follow-up questions. Sitting in her car in the parking lot with Marcus's head resting on her lap, Jennifer realized that something was deeply wrong. Patricia's reaction had been fear, not defensiveness, and fear suggested that whatever the numbers represented, it was worse than simple accounting error or lazy bookkeeping. Jennifer went home and drafted a formal letter, certified and notarized, requesting a complete financial audit of the Oak Ridge Heights HOA funds for the past 3 years. She submitted it the next morning, and within hours she received an email from Charles Vining saying that the board would take her request under advisement. What Jennifer didn't know yet was that Patricia Wooding had spent that same evening making phone calls, frantic, desperate phone calls, and by the next morning everything would begin to unravel in ways Jennifer could never have anticipated. 3 weeks passed before the board officially approved Jennifer's audit request. 3 weeks that seemed designed to buy time for reasons Jennifer couldn't yet understand. During that period, she noticed that Patricia Wooding had stopped attending the monthly community events that she usually participated in. Her house seemed dark most evenings. Jennifer's attempts to wave at her through her garage door were met with averted eyes. The audit firm that Charles Vining selected was called Meridian Financial Services. They were local, reputable, and apparently experienced in HOA audits. Jennifer was given the name of the lead auditor, a meticulous man named Robert Kellerman, who sent her a professional email outlining the scope and timeline. The audit would take 4 to 6 weeks, and they would need access to all financial records, bank statements, contracts, and supporting documentation. Going back 36 months, Robert scheduled his first site visit for early July, and Jennifer was there at the community center at the same time, ostensibly because she had scheduled a swim time. She watched from the pool deck as Robert and his 2 assistants carried boxes of files out of the office where Patricia normally worked. Charles Vining oversaw the process with the kind of solicitous attention that suggested he had nothing to hide, but Jennifer had learned to read beneath surface performances. His smile was too bright. His hands gestured too much. Within the first week of Robert's audit work, the first anomalies were discovered. Because Robert Kellerman was thorough, perhaps even more thorough than Jennifer, he cross-referenced every expense category against the supporting documentation. What he found was that while the landscaping expenses were indeed high, there was actually nothing wrong with those. The quotes matched the invoices, and the work appeared to have been performed. The landscaping company, Thornton's Grounds Maintenance, had provided detailed work orders for each month, but when Robert began examining the miscellaneous contractual services line items, things became murky. There were invoices from 3 different contractors, but the scope of work was vague. One contractor, listed as Henderson Solutions, had submitted invoices totaling $47,000 over 18 months, but the supporting documentation was thin. The invoices simply read, "Consulting services, X amount." No itemization, no explanation of what consultation was being provided. Robert reached out to Henderson Solutions directly. The phone number on the invoices was disconnected. The address was a mail drop in a strip mall on the edge of town. When his assistant visited in person, they found the space abandoned. There was no record of a business license under that name in the county. Robert's second week brought more discoveries. Another contractor, Capital Management Advisors, had received $23,000 in payments. Again, the invoices were vague. Again, the supporting documentation was sparse. When Robert tried to verify the business, he hit the same wall. No license. The address was a residential home where the current owners claimed never to have heard of the company. By the second week in July, Robert had identified approximately $89,000 in suspicious expenses. He reported his preliminary findings to Charles Vining, Patricia Wooding, and the rest of the board. The meeting was tense. Charles's brightness had faded. Patricia looked even more hollow than she had before, as though something vital was draining from her. The board decided to expand the scope of Robert's investigation. They wanted him to go deeper, to trace every single transaction, to identify exactly where the money had gone. Charles assured Robert that if there had been any impropriety, the board wanted to know about it immediately. Patricia said nothing. She had begun to look like a woman who was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jennifer attended a community event in the third week of July, a summer gathering in the common area with tables of food and a borrowed sound system. She positioned herself near the refreshment table, a strategically neutral location, and watched the community dynamics shift. Residents who ordinarily greeted Patricia with friendly waves now gave her a wide berth. Charles moved through the crowd with practiced charm, his hand on shoulders, his laugh loud, but his eyes kept returning to Patricia, and they were not warm. On July 25th, Robert Kellerman arrived at the community center for his twice-weekly meeting to review findings. He had requested that Patricia be present, along with Charles and David Chen. He had additional questions about several transactions, and he wanted to discuss them with the people who could provide context. Patricia never showed up. Charles arrived with a flustered expression and said that Patricia had not answered her phone. When they checked her house, her car was in the driveway, but she didn't answer the door. Charles called the police for a wellness check, which was the appropriate response, but as Jennifer would later learn from community gossip that moved through Oak Ridge like wildfire, the police found the house empty. Patricia's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was plugged in on the nightstand, but Patricia herself was gone. She had simply vanished, leaving behind the half-finished financial records and the growing pile of evidence that Robert Kellerman was methodically assembling. The audit continued, but now it had become something else entirely. It had become a mystery. The disappearance of Patricia Wooding sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge Heights. The police initially treated it as a missing person case, filed a report, and contacted her adult children, who lived in different states. None of them had heard from their mother. No one had seen her since the evening of July 24th. Her bank accounts showed no recent activity. Her credit cards were untouched. The local news picked up the story after Patricia had been missing for 5 days. HOA treasurer vanishes during financial investigation, read the headline, and suddenly Oak Ridge Heights was no longer a quiet planned community, but the center of a small media spectacle. News vans appeared at the entrance. Reporters tried to access the community for interviews. Jennifer found herself approached by a woman with a microphone asking if she had any insight into Patricia's disappearance. Jennifer had plenty of insight, or at least plenty of questions, but she gave no comment. Robert Kellerman, undeterred by the drama swirling around them, continued his audit. If anything, Patricia's disappearance seemed to sharpen his focus. Within days, he had identified the pattern that made everything make sense, or rather the pattern that explained where the money had gone. The $89,000 in suspicious expenses had all been paid to shell companies. Shell companies that, when traced through layers of registration and incorporation, led back to bank accounts held in the name of Eleanor Hartley. Theodore Hartley's wife, Eleanor, had been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in early 2022. The medical bills had been staggering, over $300,000 for surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, and follow-up care. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs had exceeded $150,000. Medical debt is a predatory thing. It swallows families whole. It forces decisions that no one should have to make. What had happened, according to the financial trail that Robert uncovered, was that Patricia had discovered the desperate situation. Theodore had quietly approached her sometime in 2022, asking if there was any flexibility in the HOA budget, any way to redirect funds that might not be closely scrutinized. Patricia had apparently said no, initially, but as Eleanor's condition worsened and the bills mounted, the pressure had intensified. The shell companies, the vague invoices, the mysterious contractors, it had all been a mechanism to funnel HOA funds to Eleanor's medical debt. Approximately $89,000 over 18 months had been siphoned from the Community Reserve Fund and the operating budget to help keep Eleanor Hartley alive. Patricia had been complicit, whether out of compassion for Eleanor's suffering, pressure from Theodore, or some combination of both. She had kept the secret and created the false documentation to hide it. When Jennifer learned this information, she felt something in her chest shift. The neat category of embezzlement became suddenly complicated. Theodore Hartley wasn't some corrupt board member enriching himself. He was a man watching his wife suffer, facing catastrophic medical debt, and he had apparently resorted to stealing from the community to keep her alive. But Patricia's vanishing suggested that something else was happening. If it was simple embezzlement, why had Patricia run? Why had she left everything behind? Jennifer found herself at the community center on a Saturday morning, ostensibly to use the gym, but really to see if she could catch Theodore Hartley. She found him in the maintenance office, surrounded by work orders and supplies catalogs. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished somehow. His face was drawn and his hands trembled slightly as he reviewed paperwork. Jennifer made a mental note of his appearance and left without approaching him. She was beginning to understand that this situation had ripples she hadn't yet reached. That night she sat at her dining room table with Marcus's head in her lap and thought about the question that was now burning in her mind. If Patricia had been helping Theodore and Eleanor, why had she run? What had scared her enough to leave her purse, her phone, her life behind? The disappearance was no longer mysterious. It was terrifying. The police investigation into Patricia Wooding's disappearance stalled almost immediately. She was an adult with no signs of foul play at her home. She had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. The most logical explanation was that she had left voluntarily, likely in response to the pressure of the financial investigation. When you're facing potential criminal charges, fleeing starts to look rational, but Jennifer couldn't accept that explanation. Something about the way Patricia had trembled in the hallway before the audit began, something about the frantic tone she'd heard when Patricia suggested that Jennifer demand an audit. It all painted a picture of someone in distress beyond simple financial consequences. Robert Kellerman's audit report was completed in the 4th week of August. The findings were comprehensive and devastating. Approximately $89,300 had been misappropriated from the HOA funds through the shell company scheme. The money had been traced to medical providers and institutions that had treated Eleanor Hartley. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Theodore Hartley had the motive. Patricia Wooding had the access. Together, they had stolen from the community. Charles Vining called an emergency board meeting and invited the police. The detective assigned to the case, a tired man named Marcus Webb, explained that the evidence would be presented to the district attorney for consideration of charges. Both Patricia and Theodore Hartley would likely face felony theft and fraud charges. Theodore was brought in for questioning. He reportedly confessed to his role almost immediately, breaking down during his interview with Detective Webb. Yes, he had asked Patricia for help. Yes, he had directed the funds toward Eleanor's medical debt. Yes, it was wrong, but his wife was dying and he had panicked and he had made terrible choices. Theodore Hartley was arrested and released on bail. He moved out of the Oak Ridge Heights community within days, staying temporarily with his sister. Eleanor, his wife, was in remission now, at least according to the whispers that circulated through the community. The treatments had worked. She was alive. But the price had been high. Jennifer attended a community meeting in early September where Charles presented the audit findings to the residents. The atmosphere was tense. People were angry. They had paid into the reserve fund. That money was supposed to be protected. Instead, nearly $90,000 had been stolen to pay for someone else's medical debt, no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. But Jennifer was thinking about Patricia, not Theodore. Patricia, who had access to medical information she shouldn't have. Patricia, who had trembled with fear. Patricia, who had vanished. She started researching. She went to the library and spent hours on the computer, accessing public records, searching for information about Eleanor Hartley's treatment, following the threads. What she found was that Eleanor had been treated at 2 facilities, a major cancer center in the next county over, and a private clinic that specialized in experimental treatments. That private clinic was where the bulk of the payments had gone. Jennifer called the clinic, pretending to be a billing inquiry on behalf of Eleanor Hartley. She was transferred 3 times before she reached someone who could help her. Eleanor's account did indeed show multiple payments, but here was the interesting part. In addition to the payments that Theodore and Patricia had funneled through the shell companies, there were other payments. Large payments. Payments that didn't come from the HOA funds. Payments that came from someone named Patricia Wooding, directly, from her personal bank account. Patricia had been using her own money too. At least $47,000 of her own personal savings had gone toward Eleanor's treatment. Jennifer sat in the library parking lot staring at her notebook where she had written down the figure and realized that this wasn't a story about embezzlement and financial crimes. This was a story about someone who had been trapped, someone who had made choices that spiraled from one compromise to the next until she was drowning. She pulled up the file on the private clinic and called their administrative office again, this time with a different question. She asked which patients at the clinic had received treatment involving experimental protocols. The woman on the phone wasn't supposed to answer, but Jennifer was persistent and vague enough about her reasons that she managed to get a partial answer. Eleanor Hartley had been enrolled in a trial program in late 2021. Jennifer did a search for the trial. It was a new immunotherapy approach, cutting-edge, expensive. Insurance rarely covered it. You had to have insurance that was willing to fight, or you had to have money. Eleanor apparently had neither, until Patricia stepped in. But there was something else. Jennifer pulled up Eleanor's case more carefully, searching for every reference to her treatment, and then she found something that made her hands go cold. In May of 2023, Eleanor Hartley had been flagged for a program review. The clinic had conducted an investigation into her insurance status and her treatment protocols. And in July of 2023, just last month, there had been a note on her file. A note that said, "Status review incomplete pending clarification of payment sources." Someone at the clinic had noticed that Eleanor was receiving expensive treatment despite having insurance that shouldn't be covering it. Someone had started asking questions, and if someone was asking questions, that meant they might be asking whether Eleanor's treatment was being subsidized by fraud. Jennifer suddenly understood what had frightened Patricia enough to run. It wasn't the HOA audit. It was the possibility that her attempts to save Eleanor's life were about to expose her to criminal charges for healthcare fraud, not just financial fraud. Patricia hadn't fled because she'd been caught stealing from the HOA. She'd fled because the clinic investigation was about to discover that she'd been funneling stolen money into an experimental treatment program, potentially committing fraud against insurance companies and the clinic itself. And if the clinic was investigating, if someone was asking the right questions, then Patricia knew she was about to lose everything. She had already lost her job, her position in the community, her reputation. She was about to lose her freedom as well. So she had run, leaving behind everything that mattered, because staying meant facing charges that could have sent her to prison for years. By late September, Jennifer had pieced together enough of the picture to understand that the official narrative, simple embezzlement for medical debt, was incomplete. She decided to hire a private investigator, a move that seemed extreme but felt necessary. His name was Marcus, an ironic coincidence given her dog's name, and he specialized in financial crimes and fraud investigation. Jennifer provided Marcus with everything she had found: the medical clinic payments, the insurance records she'd managed to access, the timeline of the trial program, and the cryptic note about the status review. Marcus nodded along and then got to work with the kind of focused intensity that Jennifer recognized from her own personality. What he discovered was even more complicated than Jennifer had suspected. The private clinic, Lifespan Advanced Medicine, was under investigation by the State Medical Board and the FBI. Not because of Eleanor Hartley's case specifically, but because the clinic had been engaged in a systematic pattern of billing fraud. They had been enrolling patients in experimental protocols and billing insurance companies at inflated rates. In some cases, they had been enrolling patients who didn't qualify for the programs. In other cases, they had been billing for treatments that were never provided. Lifespan Advanced Medicine, it turned out, was running a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme, and Eleanor Hartley, despite her genuine illness and genuine need, had become inadvertently enmeshed in that scheme because Patricia had chosen to pay for her treatment at that clinic. But here was where it got darker. The clinic had protocols, and those protocols included something that Patricia probably hadn't anticipated. When a patient received treatment outside their insurance coverage, the clinic had a responsibility to verify the source of the funds. They needed to ensure that the money wasn't coming from illegal sources. When Eleanor's file had been flagged in May 2023, it wasn't just a routine review. The clinic had contacted law enforcement. They had disclosed that Eleanor was receiving treatment funded by someone other than herself or her insurance, and they had provided details about Patricia's payments. The FBI had begun a parallel investigation into whether Eleanor was knowingly participating in insurance fraud. Patricia had run because she had discovered, or suspected, that there was an active investigation into Eleanor's treatment. If the FBI was involved, if healthcare fraud charges were looming, then everything had changed. It wasn't just an HOA audit anymore. It was federal crime. Detective Webb, the local officer who had been assigned to the Patricia Wooding missing person case, wasn't aware of the FBI investigation at first. But when Marcus contacted him with this new information, Webb began making calls. Within days, it became clear that there were at least 3 separate investigations running in parallel: the local police investigation into embezzlement from the HOA, the FBI investigation into healthcare fraud at Lifespan Advanced Medicine, and the State Medical Board investigation into the clinic's practices. Patricia Wooding was potentially caught in the middle of all 3, Theodore Hartley, having confessed to the HOA theft and accepted responsibility for his role, was not aware of the larger investigation into the clinic where his wife had been treated. Eleanor, who had simply been seeking treatment that might save her life, didn't know that the clinic providing her care was a fraud operation under federal investigation. Jennifer attended a community meeting in October where the updated findings were discussed. Robert Kellerman presented additional information about the payments and the nature of the shell companies. Charles Vining, looking haggard and diminished, announced that the HOA had filed a civil suit against Theodore Hartley and Patricia Wooding for the stolen funds. A civil judgment was unlikely to recover the money, but it would establish liability. What wasn't mentioned in that meeting was that the district attorney had contacted the clinic, had confirmed the FBI investigation, and had begun to unravel a much larger and more complex web of fraud. The story that had started as a simple question about landscaping budget inconsistencies had turned into something that reached far beyond Oak Ridge Heights. It had exposed not just Theodore and Patricia's desperation, but the criminal operations of a medical clinic that had been exploiting sick people for profit. Patricia Wooding, wherever she was still missing. But Jennifer was no longer worried about Patricia being a thief. She was worried about Patricia being destroyed by circumstances she had only partially created. Patricia Wooding was found in a rented room in a small town in Virginia, nearly 4 hours away from Oak Ridge Heights, in early November. A landlord had become concerned when she hadn't paid rent and hadn't answered her door for several days. When he entered the room, he found her alive, but barely. She was dehydrated, malnourished, and had apparently spent the better part of 2 months in that room, barely leaving except for brief trips to buy food. She was hospitalized for several days, treated for dehydration and malnutrition, and evaluated by psychiatric professionals. The official reason for her disappearance, according to the statement she eventually gave to Detective Webb, was fear, panic. a sense that her entire life was about to collapse and that staying in one place, visible to anyone searching for her, was impossible. She had no plan to flee. She had simply gotten in her car and driven, eventually finding a room in a town where no one knew her, where she could become invisible. When she was eventually brought back to face charges, the landscape had shifted dramatically. The district attorney, armed with new information from the FBI investigation, offered Patricia a deal. If she would cooperate with the federal investigation into lifespan advanced medicine, if she would provide information about Eleanor Hartley's treatment and payment history, the local charges against her would be reduced, Patricia agreed. She had nothing left to lose, and cooperation at least offered a path forward that might be shorter than years of litigation and prison time. What emerged from Patricia's cooperation was a comprehensive picture of the clinic's fraud. Lifespan Advanced Medicine had been systematically billing insurance companies for treatments that were either overpriced, unnecessary, or in some cases completely fabricated. They had enrolled vulnerable patients, people desperate and dying, in experimental protocols that they had no genuine interest in studying. They had promised miraculous cures that couldn't possibly exist. Eleanor Hartley was one of many victims. Her cancer was real, her need for treatment was real. But the clinic had exploited that reality. They had charged Eleanor's insurance company $200,000 for a 6-month program, when similar treatments elsewhere cost between $40,000 and $80,000. They had claimed experimental status for protocols that were essentially standard chemotherapy regimens wrapped in pseudoscientific language. Patricia had wanted to help Eleanor live. Instead, she had inadvertently funneled money to a criminal enterprise that was preying on the desperate and dying. Theodore Hartley's charges were eventually modified. The prosecutor acknowledged that his theft, while wrong, had been motivated by desperate circumstances and had been directed toward a legitimate medical need. He received probation, community service, and was required to pay restitution to the HOA. The HOA agreed to accept a payment plan that wouldn't destroy him financially, allowing him to maintain his job and his recovery. Eleanor Hartley, meanwhile, had to be removed from the clinic's care and transferred to legitimate treatment providers. The clinic's medical license was revoked. Criminal charges were filed against the clinic's founder and several staff members. Patricia Wooding received 2 years of probation, required to maintain employment, and was ordered to pay back what she could of the money she had stolen from the HOA. But because of her cooperation, she avoided prison time. She also received treatment for anxiety and depression, conditions that had clearly been exacerbated by the stress of her situation. Jennifer attended the community meeting in December, where the final audit report was presented and the resolution of the case was discussed. Charles Vining, announcing his resignation as HOA president, presented the findings with a somber tone. The community had lost nearly $90,000. 2 community members had engaged in theft, though for reasons that complicated any simple moral judgment. And unknowingly, the community had been supporting a criminal medical enterprise. Jennifer sat in the back of the room and thought about the path that had led here. She had asked a simple question about landscaping expenses. That question had led to an audit. The audit had exposed theft. The theft had revealed desperation. The desperation had illuminated a much larger crime. Patricia Wooding was no longer a villain in Jennifer's mind. She was a woman who had been trapped by compassion, by the impossible circumstances of watching someone you care about suffer, and by a healthcare system and criminal enterprise that had exploited that compassion. Theodore Hartley was a man who had stolen, but who was now rebuilding. Eleanor Hartley was a woman who had survived cancer, but had been victimized by a fraudulent clinic. And Jennifer Martinez, the meticulous woman who had simply wanted answers to questions about budget inconsistencies, had inadvertently exposed a medical fraud operation and changed the lives of everyone involved. The community moved forward. The reserve fund was replenished through a special assessment, though residents complained bitterly about it. A new treasurer was hired, with enhanced oversight and accounting procedures. Theodore Hartley eventually moved away to take a job in another state, where his wife could begin her recovery without the weight of community judgment. Patricia Wooding eventually moved back to her house in Oak Ridge Heights, marked forever by her choices but slowly rebuilding a life that had been shattered. And Jennifer Martinez continued her walks with Marcus, enjoying the quiet community she had chosen, grateful that the numbers had finally revealed their truth. But in quiet moments, she wondered if Patricia ever thought about those desperate months, about the choices that had seemed necessary at the time, about how quickly a life could spiral when faced with impossible circumstances. And she wondered if Patricia knew that the person who had inadvertently destroyed her old life had done so simply by asking for answers. Some truths Jennifer had learned came with a cost far higher than anyone anticipated.